Okay, in this video, I'm going to walk you through the installation steps required to remove the factory rear fender from your new Suzuki GSX-S1000 and install the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator kit. Now before we get to the installation steps, I just want to go over a couple of the quick details of the Fender Eliminator for the GSX-S1000. It's a single piece design made from CNC laser cut and bent 1/8" thick aluminum. It's coated in a UV resistant satin black powder coat. It's set up for the OEM license plate light and turn signals, as well as has accommodations for aftermarket turn signals using the M10 stud. That's really common. Comes with a full set of corrosion resistant hardware, aluminum spacers and stainless steel bolts and lock washers. Also includes a grommet on the top end to prevent wire chafing, as well as bumpers on the license plate mount to prevent vibration. One of the really cool details of our Fender Eliminators for this bike it's a one-piece design with tabs folded in, so you get when the bolts come through here, you get a very strong kind of gusset in here, so it's a lot stiffer than any of the other kind of Fender Eliminators you'll see with just a single bend up here. One of the other cool details of this is you can see it's got a contoured top plate, and that's going to fit in perfectly with the pocket on the rear end of your motorcycle for a totally flush appearance. So two of the really unique things about our Fender Eliminator that the competition doesn't have. Now as for the tools you'll need to complete the installation, you'll need a 4 and a 5mm Allen wrench, an 8 and a 10mm open end wrench, 10mm socket and a ratchet, a Phillips head screwdriver, and a set of snips or flush cutters or something out just to cut a zip tie. Now if you don't have them in your toolbox, the 4 and the 5mm, the 10mm wrench, and the Phillips screwdriver are all available in the toolkit underneath the rider seat on your bike. Everything else you're going to have to get separately. Now we're going to start the installation for the Fender Eliminator by removing the factory rear fender, and the first steps involved in that are going to be to remove the rider seat and passenger seat. And the rider seat or the passenger seat is going to pop right out with a key in the left side of the frame, and the rider seat is held in with a single bolt at the rear. You're going to use your 5mm Allen key to remove that bolt, and then the rider seat is just going to lift and slide rearward, and you'll set both those seats to the side. Before you can remove the factory rear fender bolts and pull the whole fender out of the motorcycle, we've got to disconnect the wiring harness for the turn signals and the license plate light. And that wiring harness is going to come, it's in 3 separate looms, and it's going to come out of the tail of the bike into the storage area underneath the passenger seat, and it's going to run alongside the right side subframe spar. And the connectors are all the way down in here, and everything's kind of tucked under the side panel. And rather than having to go and remove this whole side panel, which is kind of a pain, it's worth it to just kind of dig in and disconnect these the 3 connectors, which are kind of buried back here. So the bike's going to have 2 reusable zip ties, one back under the passenger seat and one right by your battery or your main fuse box. And I'd recommend loosening both of those and removing them. We'll reuse them when we reinstall everything. There's one more zip tie back here that's holding on I think it's the main relay or flasher relay, and that is also going to have to be loosened. But if you can see, there's actually 3 connectors, and I'm going to move the camera so that you can see them better. But there's a gray, a black, and they're all 2-pin connectors. And then in this case right now, there's a white, and it's maybe hard to see in this angle, but it's tucked in under here. And first things first, we're going to disconnect these 3, and then I'll move the camera and we can see that 3rd zip tie and how to loosen it and pull those cables out. So start by disconnecting the 3 connectors. For all these, you just lift up on the tab, and that's going to release the connector. So we'll do it for the black, the gray, and then if you should be able to see it, there's a white as well. So this harness is going to stay with the bike, and then there's the 3 that we're going to pull out, and that's going to come out with the fender. And like I mentioned, there's one more cable tie, and it's kind of hiding under this panel. It's holding on your flasher relay, and it's got a lot more wires than just the ones we want to take out. So rather than try to remove the whole thing, all I recommend is to loosen it, and then we can pull out the 3 looms that we care about. And you can see there's the tab, or the tail of the zip tie, and you can kind of reach down with one finger and open the zip tie and push open a loop. So you can kind of at least loosen a good portion of that loom. And then all you really want to do is one by one get out. There's the white connector. Have to work a little bit. There we go. So there they are. The white, gray, and black. These are you're gonna pull these out around. They kind of tuck through a portion of the subframe, and then once you get them to the point where they're going directly into the fender, we're ready to pull the whole factory rear fender as one assembly. So I'm going to really quickly point out the 4 10mm head hex bolts you're going to have to remove to pull off the factory rear fender. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's where you're going to use your 10mm socket to remove those 4 bolts. So we're going to go ahead and remove those 4 10mm hex bolts to release the factory rear fender. Now, 2 of them in the back are kind of deep, so I recommend an extension on your socket. And once you get them loose, often you can remove the socket and just use the extension. I find it easier to remove the rear 2 because those are much harder to get a socket on. Once all 4 bolts are out, guide the 3 connectors back through that hole in the undertail, and then take the whole fender off to a bench so we can break it down. First step to breaking down your factory rear fender is going to be to remove your plate. I find that every dealer does something a little bit different, but in this case it's Phillips head and a nylock nut on the back side. The 10mm wrench works well enough to hold the nylock so it doesn't just spin the whole assembly. And then once we get the plate off, set that aside. I'm going to go ahead and break down the 2 pieces of the factory rear fender. And so the inner shell is held on by 5 Phillips head kind of thread cutting screws going into plastic. So use your Phillips head screwdriver and remove those guys. Now we're actually going to reuse, and I'll go over it a little bit more in detail when we get to the license plate light, but we're actually going to use 2 of these bolts as part of the Fender Eliminator installation, so don't immediately just throw them all away. And you don't have to use the toolkit screwdriver for this, although it works just fine. Alright, so once you get the back shell, which is actually the primary structural support for the factory fender, open, what you're going to see is the wiring harness for the factory turn signals and license plate light. And there's going to be a zip tie here holding it to that last 5th mount, and that's what you're going to use your snips or a knife or whatever just to cut that zip tie. That's going to free up all your connectors to slide back through, and at this point you're ready to take everything out. So we're going to start with the turn signals, and turn signals are just going to have a cable pass through, and they're going to have an 8mm flange nut holding on a little threaded stub shaft coming into the rear fender. So just got to loosen and remove that nut, and it's you'll have to use your 8mm open end to get in there. So once you remove those two nuts, the turn signals are just kind of unplug. There's a plastic boss on the fender that helps support the turn signal. So you're just going to pull it straight out and then pull the harness out of the factory rear fender. And that leaves us with the factory turn or license plate light. And so once again, you're going to get your Phillips screwdriver and you're going to loosen those guys. And so we are going to reuse the license plate light because that's a nice durable unit. It looks very nice on the bike. The one thing we are not going to use is this plastic extension, because that is not something that looks very good. So in your fender, as you pull your license plate light out, you're also going to have this nice grommet, and we are going to reuse that. So that you're just going to pull out, and you can see that kind of interesting shape cutout is mimicked in the Fender Eliminator. So we're going to take advantage of that nice weather resistant boot, and we're going to reuse this whole assembly except for this kind of long ugly plastic extension. And since we don't need that, you can remove the boot, slide the extension out, and in this case we're going to reuse the boot, so slide the whole assembly back on over the license plate light. And one thing to note with this rubber boot is there actually is a tiny little notch, and all that is an opening to let moisture or anything else drain. So you always want to have that facing down rather than up, where it's actually going to collect moisture and capture it. So at this point you're done with the factory rear fender, and we can start talking about the reassembly onto the Fender Eliminator. Now for this installation we are going to use reuse the factory turn signals, but this Fender Eliminator with that larger of the two holes, which passes the connector through for the factory turn signals, will also work for the very common M10 threaded stud that you can get on any number of LED and aftermarket turn signals. And so that's just going to thread, for example, so we're not going to install these, but if you were going to run aftermarket turn signals, that's the hole you would use. Very simple. Put your stud through the larger of the two holes and check the supplied nut, and that nut's going to come with your turn signals. And then you're going to run your harness through the grommet. And the one note is that most turn signals are not going to be terminated with an appropriate connector. Like these are just bullets, where you're either going to need to tap into the factory harness, likely extend it, or cut off your factory harness from your OEM turn signals and solder it onto the aftermarkets. So we're going to go ahead and install the factory turn signals into the Fender Eliminator for this installation. I recommend starting with the turn signals as opposed to the license plate light, just because it's a little bit easier. So feed the electrical connectors through the larger of the two holes, and then pass the stud through the smaller of the two. And then you're going to flip it over and install the factory nut onto the threaded stud. And then you're going to use your 8mm wrench to suck the whole assembly in. And one thing we will want to be careful of is we're going to want to orient the you can twist the light about that stud to align it to a horizontal plane, and It should be very close to this, kind of following the lines of the Fender Eliminator, but we'll adjust that once we get, or you can adjust it once it gets on the bike. But I recommend you kind of line up that back curve roughly with the turn signal. And because this stud goes directly into rubber, you don't need to make it crazy tight. You will feel the resistance, in this case the stud on this one's a little tight in the hole, but you will feel the resistance ramp up when it starts to kind of suck everything together. But you do not want to over tighten these, because you really could pull the stud out of the rubber mount. And the easiest way to tell which is your right and which is your left is going to be the text that's printed on the bottom, or you can look at the font or the text printed into the actual lens. But the other way is going to be black is your right and gray is your left for the connectors. So repeat the whole process for the right turn signal, and then use your 8mm. In this case it's a ratcheting one just to make it a little quicker, but it does not need to be that way. So you'll feel the resistance ramp up. Check that it's actually seated. If it isn't, it might just be the shank a little tight on the hole, but keep going until you see that gap close down. And then you still have a little bit of twist flexibility. You can tell in this case we're going to want to rotate this guy up. So if you do have to adjust the rotation, you may have to loosen it a little bit, and you should be able to twist it. And this is only a one-time setup, but obviously you want your right and your left turn signals to be generally level to the ground and certainly even with each other. Once you get your turn signals kind of aligned and tight, you can pass both connectors through the rubber grommet, and you can leave the grommet installed in the Fender Eliminator for the duration of this installation. So pull your two wires relatively snug, and then that will get us going to the license plate light. So like I mentioned earlier, you want to remove that big thick spacer that came with the or that was on the factory bike, and it actually does help during this installation, or it is required. You kind of separate those two, because once these plastic plugs or bosses slide into the grommet, it's going to get way too tight to install in the Fender Eliminator. So start with the connector, slide it through, and then just kind of jam this big rubber grommet into that 3-lobed hole on the Fender Eliminator, and you'll have to kind of work it around a little bit, but it should eventually sit, obviously not like that, nice and cleanly, and that you can grab it from the back side and pull it around. But once you're done, you'll see it kind of sits nicely into that cutout, and then just slide the license plate light, kind of use those two bosses to line into the two holes, and it should kind of tighten the whole assembly up. And the one thing I mentioned earlier is you do want that little hole to be a drain hole and to be facing down. Now as for the hardware we're going to use for the license plate light, the original OEM hardware for the license plate light are these two long screws, and because we removed that big thick spacer, those screws are no longer going to work. But coincidentally, you can take 2 of the 5 screws, the shorter ones that actually connected those 2 plastic pieces of the factory fender. We're going to kind of cannibalize those 2 and pull the washers off the 2 long guys and put them on 2 of the 5 short ones. So the other short ones we're just going to keep. You can use them to assemble your factory fender back together if you want to kind of keep it for storage. So it's important that you use the large fender washers on these bolts, and they're going to screw right into the back of the license plate light, and the large washer face is going to compress that rubber grommet and kind of tighten everything up. Now the rubber grommet's very nice because it keeps vibration down to a certain extent, as well as kind of weatherproofs the assembly. So using your Phillips screwdriver, and these, you're going to tighten these two bolts up, and just like any kind of plastic tapped feature, you're not going to want to tighten these crazy tight. I mean, you'll definitely feel them get snug, and you can put a nice little torque on them, but there's absolutely no need to go crazy on that, because if you strip those out, your light is garbage. So the last step is going to be to take the white connector and feed that through. That'll be the last electrical connector through the Fender Eliminator, and this is where things start to get a little snug, and that's good, because that means it's going to be going to hold all the cables in a good location, as well as prevent kind of road spray and things like that from coming up into the bike. And so what you should end up with, I managed to twist this up a little more than I should have. What you'll end up with is the last connector you're going to pull up is obviously the license plate light, and you can actually get a little bit of that boot into the grommet, at which point you're very well weather sealed and everything is nice and tight. These cables are not going to pull themselves out, and they're not going to chafe on this Fender Eliminator because they're all secured in this rubber grommet. At this point, I would actually save the installation of the license plate until it's on the motorcycle, just because it's a lot easier just to handle. So at this point, we're ready to install the Fender Eliminator on the motorcycle. So as for the hardware you're going to get with the Fender Eliminator kit, you're going to take all the bolts and all the spacers are exactly the same length, so there's no way to mix this up. But when you install this on the motorcycle, you're going to take a bolt, put a lock washer under the head of it, slide it through the bottom space of the Fender Eliminator, and then when it installs on the motorcycle, you're going to use one of the spacers in between the Fender Eliminator and the subframe of the bike, and that's going to fill in that big deep pocket on the bottom of the GSX-S1000 and make a very nice underside appearance. So we'll get to the installation of that on the bike, but that's how, for each of these 4 holes, that's exactly how this hardware stack's going to go. Now when we go to install the Fender Eliminator on the motorcycle, what I'd recommend is actually put the hardware in for the front 2 mounts only. Trying to do it all for 4 at the same time is going to be pretty tricky unless you've got an extra set of hands. So again, the lock washer and the bolt go on one side, the bolt comes through pointed up, and then we're putting 2 spacers, or 4 spacers, in this case 2 are showing right now, and the spacers going between the Fender Eliminator and the mount on the motorcycle, and that's appropriately spacing the Fender Eliminator to fill in all the gaps. So the first step of the installation is going to be to take your 3 connectors and feed it up through the rectangular hole in the undertail of the motorcycle from whence they originally came, and you can leave them loose for now. And then you're going to take your 4mm Allen key in the head of one of the button head screws, and you can do this process 1 bolt at a time and get it started. Get the first bolt started, just a few threads. You don't need to tighten it, or you should not tighten it all the way. And then move to the next bolt and get it started, a few threads. And once you've got the front 2, a couple threads in, you can see the Fender Eliminator kind of tilts down, allows you to tilt down a little bit, and that's really going to help you get your next pair of bolts in and spacers. So you're going to feed the bolt up through the hole and install the spacer. And ideally, you do that for both of the rear bolts before you kind of push the whole assembly up and attempt to install it. So it's not trivial, but if you do it this way, and you can actually start these last 2 or the rear 2 by hand, at least get a couple threads in. So once you've got all the bolts in, a few threads, no more spacers can fall out on you. You can kind of take your time, pull the harness tight, and you should see the Fender Eliminator kind of tuck into that funky shaped opening on the bottom of the GSX-S. So start tightening your bolt a little bit on one, and then move to its neighbor. And those spacers are going to allow you to take these bolts to full torque, so you're not worried about crushing plastics on the tail of your bike. It's going to pull it into that pocket on the bottom of the motorcycle, and then it's going to bottom out against the spacer. And that's a pretty important part of this Fender Eliminator, such that when you're done, it's rock solid. And we'll show you some views of it once it's finally finished up. And it's totally flush with the underside of the bike, which is really nice. So using your 4mm, once you feel those spacers bottom out, you can take a pretty big, these are M6 bolts, so they can take a good torque load. So fully tighten all of them, and you don't need a torque wrench for this, but nice and snug, especially if you use the toolkit wrench. You really can't go too crazy, but this is just a Fender Eliminator. So make sure you've got kind of equal torque with your hand torque wrench around 4 pattern. And we got lock washers on there, so that's going to keep things from vibrating loose. So once you've got that done, we can install a license plate and then finish up the wiring. Now to install a license plate, you're just going to reuse factory hardware that came with the motorcycle. In the case of this bike, it's Phillips head screws on the front and 10mm lock nut on the back, or close to 10mm. Seems like they put standard hardware on a lot of these bikes for some reason. But in any case, now's the easiest time to install it. So for me, I need a 10mm wrench to hold the lock nut on the back, and a Phillips to send it home. And the Fender Eliminator has slots in it to accommodate kind of a wide range of license plates. So for this stage, you're going to want to center it by eye, and all it takes is a little bit of loosening if you need to shift the plate one way or the other. And one of the nice things about all our Fender Eliminators is those 2 rubber bumpers on the bottom, which keep the plate from buzzing. And it's not such a big deal on a smooth motor like on the GSX-S, but on some bikes, it makes all the difference. The Fender Eliminator bolted up, we just have to run the factory wiring back towards those connectors, and start by running it through that U-channel in the subframe, matching the original factory wiring. And then the last tricky part is getting these 3 connectors back through that. It should be still loose, that wiring cable tie that's got your flasher relay on it. So one at a time, you can feed your cables through there. And I recommend, you certainly don't have to. It matches the factory wiring, and that's never a bad thing to do. So, especially if you're not trying to block a camera, it's not too bad. Just gotta get some light in there, and you can pass those 3 connectors through that. And then it's as simple as matching your colors and connecting your 3, your 2 turn signals and your license plate, so your 3 connectors. So my recommendation for managing your extra wire is going to be to pull, kind of simulate the whole front half as if it were the factory bike. So pull that relatively snug, and we can reuse excuse me, both of our temper or our reusable wire ties that we pulled off. And so you would use one up front and coil in a service loop your extra wiring, and tie your bundle back using the second reusable tie. So we take the first tie, we're going to thread it not through those cables but under your subframe, and it's definitely a 2-handed affair. loop it back around, and grab your front side of the harness, and you can kind of make sure those tuck out of the way so the seat won't ever rub on them, and give that a very, very light pull. Give that a pull in your harness, take all the slack out, tighten that kind of hidden cable tie. That's going to secure your rear harness. And then the last one, like I said, what I would do is take your extra wire, make a coil, and one thing you do want to do is pick up, there's one more wiring harness back there. So as long as you get, got it. Try easier to do it this way. Much easier. There we go. So hit your 3 harnesses, or your 3 looms that we've been working with, as well as the one that we haven't been touching. I like to coil it into a loop along the back into that pocket, and then secure it. And that should not give you any trouble. It's very factory looking and reuses all the factory components. Once you're all done buttoning it up, it's worth it to do a quick system check with the key on. Make sure you've got your license plate light on, your tail light on, even though we shouldn't have touched that harness. Get your right turn signal, your left turn signal. So once that's all good, like I mentioned, if you need to adjust the angle to get your turn signals a little more horizontal, you can loosen that 8mm nut, twist it so it looks just how you want it, and then tighten it up. At that point, it should be very stable over the life of the bike. Now that we're all complete with the installation of the Fender Eliminator, I just want to give you a couple extra walk around views so you can see all the tight clearances. There's no large gaps in this, which makes it really nice from a water ingress standpoint. Got the extra grommet to help weather seal it. You can see how tight fitting our Fender Eliminator goes into that kind of T-shaped hole in the bottom of the motorcycle. You can see those 2 bolts at the rear that attach to the subframe actually go through 2 flanges of sheet metal. So it's an ultra stiff design, reuses all the OEM lights, so it's totally legal. And I want to say thank you for watching the installation video. Our products can be found on Amazon, eBay, or direct through our website at www.vagabondmotorsports.com. Thanks.